Hi everyone. Sorry for not being there today. I am quite ill. I will probably be pausing the video often to cough. Um, Talking for extended period is not very good for me right now. Sorry I can't be there. Yeah, I'm just gonna do a quick lecture on Aristotle's function argument and some problems that I think all of us have with it. You all included, some of you were already starting to articulate these when we finished last week. So we'll just go into those briefly. Give me just a minute. Okay, let's get to it. So, let's take a look at Aristotle's function argument once again. So this is 1097b lines 22 all the way until quite a ways. So I'll go ahead and read the key parts. So again, the point of what we're trying to do, as you can see here, is we're trying to figure out what happiness amounts to. And so Aristotle thinks we can figure out that answer by looking at what the function of the human being is. You'll see how in just a second. So here's the idea. So the key passage here is, let me figure out how to highlight this. Okay, the first key line is, for all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in the function, so it would seem to be for man if he has a function. So the idea here is you can tell what a good version of something is by looking at whether it performs its function well. And for the purposes of the simple function argument or the naive function argument, we're interpreting function to mean purpose. So for anything that has a purpose, it's a good X if it fulfills its purpose well. So that is what our first premise is. For all things that have a purpose, the good of that thing resides in performing its purpose well. Okay. Premise 2. Aristotle continues, have the carpenter then and tanner certain functions or activities, and humans have none? Are they born without a function? Or as eye, hand, foot, and in general each of the parts evidently has a function, may one lay it down that humans similarly have a function apart from these? So this seems to be an argument here. He's saying that since each of the humans' parts have a purpose, so too must the whole thing have a purpose. So that's our second premise, as we see here. Second premise, human beings have a purpose. Okay, third premise. What then can this be? Life seems to belong even to plants, but we are seeking what is peculiar to humans. Let us exclude, therefore, the life of nutrition and growth. Next, there would be the life of perception, but it also seems to be shared even by the horse, the ox, and every animal. Okay, so he's saying whatever it is that the human being's purpose is, has to be special to us. Peculiar is his word. And what he means there is it has to be something distinctive about humans that sort of sets us apart from other creatures or other things with purposes. You'll notice that he doesn't really give an argument for this. When we move to the sophisticated function argument, we'll see that this third premise is really straightforward. But when we interpret the word ergon as purpose, it's really not straightforward. Premise 3 kind of seems false or just confused or something like that. Okay, so let's continue on. You might be able to hear my cat meowing. She's about to get fed. Okay. There remains then an active life of the element that has reason. I'm trying to figure out function of activity. The function of man is an activity of soul which follows or implies reason. That's the key passage here. I'll highlight it so we can see it. The way I've been putting this is that rational deliberation is the activity of human beings that is peculiar to us. So let me write this out. Rational deliberation is a technical term, and it means the ability to decide what to do on the basis of reasons. That is, deciding what to do by figuring out, by thinking about which reason which action you have more reason to do, which one you have less reason to do, and so on. That's what rational deliberation is. And Aristotle thinks that this is peculiar to human beings. It's unique to us. No other creature, Aristotle thinks, rationally deliberates, at least in the sophisticated way that we do. Okay, the conclusion then. So, for anything that has a purpose, the good of that thing resides in performing its purpose well. Human beings have a purpose. The purpose of human beings is rational deliberation. That's premise 4. From this, Aristotle thinks we can conclude that the good life is a life of rational deliberation, of rationally deliberating well, doing a good job of it. Since that's our purpose, and to be a good human is to fulfill the purpose of a human well, we ought to rationally deliberate well. That's what Aristotle thinks the purpose of human beings is, and what the good life amounts to. So eudaimonia, for Aristotle, is actually going to be fairly straightforward. It's going to be rationally deliberating well. Now, what that amounts to, more difficult question that we'll get into. But before we get that, like I said, in this class, I'm trying to offer you arguments that you're supposed to accept, that are supposed to be convincing to you. And I don't know about you all, but this argument does not seem that convincing to me. Now, if we were in person, I would have you talk with one another to try to find out what all the problems are with this argument. But since we can't do that, I'm just going to walk through some problems I have with this. And this will be one of your exam questions, is to walk through a couple of these objections. So what I'm going to present you is with objections. Now, objections are arguments made against an argument or theory that's meant to undermine it in one way or another. What I'm going to do is I'm going to question each of the premises. I think that there's something suspicious about each one. So let's go through it. So the first one says, for all things that have a purpose, the good of that thing resides in it performing its purpose well, or fulfilling its purpose well, I think is the phrase I used in class. Okay, so this is saying anything that has a purpose, it's a good version of that thing if it fulfills its function well, its purpose well. Let me try a counterexample. So note that this is saying for anything that has a purpose, it's a good X if it fulfills its purpose well. It seems like sometimes there are things that have purposes, like express purposes, but yet the good for that thing isn't merely in fulfilling its purpose well. Here's an example, and I don't tend to use this show in my class, but it's a good one. So this is a Rick and Morty clip. Let's just watch it.
Hey Rick, I have to make a project for the science fair this weekend. You think you could help me out?
Whatever. Well, I mean, traditionally, science fairs are a father-son thing.
Well, scientifically, traditions are an idiot thing.
Morty, I think it would be fun for you to work on a science project with your dad.
Yeah, Dad, why don't we do it together?
Yes! You backed the right horse on this one, son. We'll get out the crayons, brew some coffee, and knock this thing out in 2 or 3 days.
What is my purpose?
Pass the butter. Thank you.
Dad, I need a ride to work.
Maybe Rick can give you a ride. I'm helping Morty with science.
I'm busy.
Doing what?
Anything else?
What is my purpose?
You pass butter.
Oh my god.
Yeah, welcome to the club, pal.
Okay. Oh, it's continuing on. Okay. So the idea here, I don't know if you've all seen that. Rick created a creature, a butter passing robot, and he made it for a purpose, and this purpose was to pass butter, right? That was the express purpose for which this creature was created. Now it seems like he created a creature that has sentience, has feelings, and it was disappointed to hear that its purpose is merely to pass butter. We might say that, we might go so far as to say that it is not the best life for that butter passing robot merely to pass butter. Just because it was created for the purpose of passing butter, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what makes for a good life, is merely passing butter. It has sentience, right? Seems like it could and should desire more out of a good life. So the butter passing robot has a purpose, but it seems like the good for it slash him, I don't know if it was a man, it kind of had a man voice. Butter passing robot has a purpose, but it seems like the good for it slash him is not merely passing butter. So this constitutes a counterexample. It's a case where something has a purpose, but it's not true that the good of that thing resides in fulfilling its purpose well. Maybe that example didn't do it for you. Here's another one that's very, very similar. Suppose that human beings were placed on Earth by aliens millennia ago, 10,000 years ago they were placed on Earth. And the aliens placed us on Earth for a specific reason, a purpose. And that purpose was to create microplastics. That's what they wanted. These aliens wanted microplastics that they could harvest and then use, but they didn't want to pollute their whole society using microplastics. So they made us, and they knew that we would eventually develop plastics, and capitalism is, an inevitable result of human beings. And so plastics would come and in spades and just be all over the place. So microplastics. Okay, so we were created for a purpose. Microplastics. Suppose you learn this story and you learn that it's true. The alien comes down and tells you. Would you then drop everything and go make a bunch of microplastics? Just go make as many as you possibly can. It's your purpose after all. No, you wouldn't, right? Instead, you would continue living your life as you would. Because even though human beings might have been created for some purpose, at least in this case, that doesn't really tell us what a good life amounts to. So let's put that one in. Okay, cool. So imagine humans were created for the purpose of manufacturing microplastics. It would seem that it is not a good life to merely produce microplastics. So these are two instances to think that premise one doesn't hold in all cases. And Aristotle really needs it to hold in all cases for his argument to work. Okay, let's move on to the second set of objections. So premise 2 says human beings have a purpose. Remember his argument for this. Aristotle's argument. I'm going to mute myself because that is loud typing. So remember, Aristotle's argument was that since the hands, feet, etc. all have a purpose, so too must the whole human being have a purpose. This is bad reasoning, right? Like, it has a technical name. The technical name is that this is the fallacy of composition. The basic idea is that we can't infer from the parts having some property to the whole thing having some property. That's not a legitimate inference. It goes wrong sometimes. So um, let's say we have a brick house, right? A house made entirely of bricks. And the bricks are all uniform in size, but the house is a dome. Let's say you can build a house like a dome out of bricks. Well, here is an instance of Aristotle's kind of argument. Each of the parts of the house is shaped like a brick, right? It's a rectangular, three-dimensional rectangle. Therefore, the whole house is shaped like a brick. That's false, right? The house is shaped like a dome. We can't infer anything about the shape of the house just because the parts all have a similar shape, the same shape. Similarly, just because the hands, feet, and all the parts of a human being have a purpose, that doesn't tell us anything about whether the whole human being has a purpose. This is just not legitimate reasoning. It's the fallacy of composition. So Aristotle's argument for premise 2 does not work. But I think there's an even more pressing worry with this premise, and it has to do with a certain person. That person is this guy right here, good old Charles Darwin. So Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection said that human beings are not placed here for some purpose by a divine being, but instead human beings and all species arise out of random genetic mutations, even though he didn't know about genetics, random mutations in the phenotypes of creatures, the traits of creatures, and then some of those mutations confer small survival advantages for that species, and so get passed down or hereditary. So it seems like evolution is an objection to premise 2 also. So let's go through this in a little more detail. So the theory of evolution, I don't know how much y'all learn in high school and college about the theory of evolution, but I want to talk a little bit about it because I think people can sometimes get the wrong impression about what's going on. So the theory of evolution by natural selection is the following. Let me write it out real quick. Okay, here's maybe a first pass at the theory of natural selection. It says, all traits that we see in organisms, plants, animals, all of them, are the products of random genetic mutations that sometimes confer small survival advantages on the organism, depending on their environment. So a classic example of this is, imagine we're in an environment where there's a lot of snow, maybe the Arctic, and there's a hare, a bunny, and let's say that there was a bunch of offspring from 2 parents, and among some of those offspring, they had this genetic mutation that caused their fur to be white, and in some of the others, it caused their fur to be brown. So you have some of the offspring that have white fur, some of the offspring that have brown fur. Now, given that these are prey creatures, these are creatures that, feast on the vegetation, but then occasionally get killed by hawks and coyotes and owls and all these creatures. It is advantageous for those hares to have white fur because then they blend in with the snow better, whereas the brown furred ones stick out in the snow, especially for a creature that relies on vision, a predator that relies on vision. So merely the color of the fur of the creature can confer a small survival advantage. So maybe the hares that have white fur, let's say there was 10 of the white ones and 10 of the brown ones, maybe all 10 of the white ones survive and reproduce. whereas of the brown ones, only 3 survive and reproduce because they were killed. And so you have, in the next generation of animals, you have way more white fur than you have brown fur because the white fur conferred a small survival advantage. Now compound this over 2 million years we've had life on Earth, and you get organisms that fit some ecological niche where they have these built up over time small survival advantages. That then explains all the phenotypes we see. 5 fingers, even like, the fact that our fingers wrinkle, that's, people suspect, conferred some small survival advantage. Okay, so that's the idea behind the theory of evolution. One really important point about the theory of evolution is that it is not, the phrase is teleological. So evolution is not teleological. It does not aim for any particular purpose or end goal. So let me write that word down. So evolution is not teleological. It doesn't have an end point. Evolution isn't going towards anything. Even human beings, who are the smartest creatures on Earth, it's not like evolution was like trying to make intelligent creatures. It just so happened that, in sub-Saharan Africa, a couple 100,000 years ago, it conferred a survival advantage to have primates that grew bigger and bigger brains and were useless into adulthood because, it fit an ecological niche. Maybe we needed to remember all the different types of food that we could eat, and so we did all that, learning tools, all these things. And so even human beings, it's just sort of, in one sense, a complete accident that any creature has the phenotype it has. Whereas on the other hand, it's not an accident at all because it's just evolution fulfilling ecological niches and, small survival advantages. So the idea here is creatures don't have purposes if the theory of evolution by natural selection is true. We aren't created for any reason. We just are. We just exist. All creatures just exist. And the reason they exist is just because evolution spit out some creatures. Okay, so it seems like premise 2 is false. Now, we might be able to argue Actually, I totally realized I just put this in the wrong place. So it seems like premise 2 might be false. The thing I wrote is that we might be able to argue that the purpose of human beings is survival and reproduction, right? If you like the theory of evolution by natural selection, then we might have some grounds for saying, okay, fine, evolution's not teleological, but we could talk about the purpose of humans as survival and reproduction. And so that really seems like it's an objection to 4. Okay, but whatever. Let's continue. We'll get there in a second. A thing's purpose is what is peculiar to it. I guess all of us probably have the following question. Why? Why is it that the purpose of something is just whatever's unique about it? That does not seem like there's any good reason for that. And so without a good argument for this claim, there's really no reason to accept it. Okay, let's continue. The activity of rational deliberation is peculiar to humans. Now note that there are 2 claims going on in here. One of them is that human beings are the only wait, what am I trying to say here? Yeah, there's two claims being made. Sorry, I had to look at it. I was just staring at it for like 30 seconds. One of them is that one thing human beings do that no other creature does is rational deliberation. The second claim is the only thing human beings do that no other creature does is rational deliberation. Right? Peculiar meaning one and only one creature does this. Okay, so are we the only creatures that rationally deliberate? Maybe. I mean, dolphins. What else? Other creatures might. Octopus. What about aliens? Suppose there are aliens in outer space, intelligent life forms. They probably rationally deliberate. Maybe some monkeys? Okay, so it doesn't seem like we are the only creatures to rationally deliberate. Or at least it's not obvious that we are the only creatures to rationally deliberate. But what about the other claim, that the only thing that's peculiar to us is rational deliberation? That does not seem right. Here are some examples. Making fire is something that only humans do. Destroying the environment is something only humans do. Having sex without regard to season. I almost wrote reason. How funny is that? Having sex without regard to season. Other creatures do that. So it's just false that this is the only thing that's peculiar to humans. So should we just dedicate our lives to destroying the environment because that's peculiar about us? That seems wrong. And there's a final one. And I'm not sure what this is an objection to. I actually think it's an objection to premise one. But this final objection is something like, can't we rationally deliberate for good, for bad, for evil? Can't we sometimes rationally deliberate well, in the sense that we achieve the aims we set out for ourselves, but do it for bad purposes, for evil? If that's the case, then it doesn't seem like the good of a human is merely in being able to fulfill our ends and rationally deliberate, get from point A to point B well. It seems like something else has to go into what being a good human being is, to being a good human being. So it seems like this naive function argument is really, really weak. Let me move this so you all can see. Oops. Okay, that's almost what I want to do today. The next last thing I want to do is talk about your exam, which, if we're being honest, date to be determined after this illness plus the strike next week. I'm really not sure what's going to happen. So we'll get to the exam when we do. I'll give you at least a week's notice, so don't worry too much about it. Okay, so if you go on your Canvas page, it should look like this. Actually, you'll have one more thing because it'll show this lecture that you're watching, but that's not up yet. Okay, so if you click on Aristotle Study Guide, it brings you to this page, and let's read through it. Cool, I don't want to learn more. Ooh, this is gross. Why is that so? Whatever. What follows are N essay questions. There will probably be 5, there may be 4, who knows. On the day of the exam, I will choose N-1 questions. That means I'll get rid of 1, and you will write your response to N-2 of those questions. So you'll say there's 5 total, there will be 4 on the day of the exam, and you have to write on 3 of those. Students will be graded on how well they demonstrate their understanding of the relevant philosophical concepts, views, and arguments. So it's just a regurgitation sort of thing. It's not, you don't have to be doing philosophy here. Maybe later, but not for this first one. And a little note, explaining an argument, just something that you'll have to do a couple times, amounts to explaining what each premise means and setting out the justification for each premise that would be given by someone who likes the argument. You want to think of it as if you're writing an encyclopedia entry for the argument. You're taking on the voice of somebody who likes the argument and explaining what's going on. We'll work on this in class. You don't have to worry too much about it. So here's your first one. Cultural relativism is the view that moral right and wrong is just a matter of one's culture, and as a result, there is no objective morality. Usually, cultural relativism is justified by the following argument. Premise A, different cultures disagree about morality. Conclusion, so there is no objective morality. Right and wrong is just a matter of cultural opinion. First, explain this argument. Second, explain the two criticisms of cultural relativism that we went over in class. Here are the two criticisms. Explain first why some claim that this argument is not good. Explain second why some think that the truth of cultural relativism is incompatible with many common sense facts about the practices of morality. So you're just walking through cultural relativism, the view, the argument, and then the two criticisms of it that we went over in class. Second question. Aristotle's simple function argument goes as follows. Oops, that should say naive. Let's see if this updates in real time. It does not. I'm going to have to refresh the page. There we go. Aristotle's naive function argument goes as follows. For all things, blah, blah, blah. I don't have to read it. I just went through it. Here's the question. First, explain this argument and then provide two criticisms of it. You may use the criticisms that I provided, or you may come up with your own. It's totally up to you. So the way I would suggest studying for these, it's something that you can do as you go forward, is to make outlines and talk them through with other people. I do want to give you time in class to do them, so yeah, we'll figure it out. The third one's going to be on the sophisticated function argument, which I don't know if I want to go over yet. We'll see. Let me go away for a moment and think about it, and then I'll come back and tell you. Okay, I think we should get started on the sophisticated function argument. We'll see how far we go. But yeah, I think it's smart to do. Okay, so remember that for the simple function, or the naive function argument, we interpreted the Greek word ergon, which is translated as function, as purpose. Okay, so an ergon is a thing's purpose. It's the reason for which something was created. Now, I think, as I've hopefully made clear, once we interpret it as purpose, there's a ton of problems with the argument. And so a philosopher named Christine Korsgaard in like the late 90s, said that this is not a good translation of ergon. And instead, we should interpret Aristotle as meaning not purpose, but instead we should translate ergon as characteristic activity or functioning, or something along those lines. Or product, or something like that. The working, the way something does something. Okay, so my favorite is characteristic activity. It's the most clear, it's the most precise, I think. Here is the idea. So a purpose is distinct from an ergon. How a thing does what it does. So here's the idea. A thing's purpose is what it does. A thing's ergon, or characteristic activity, is how it does what it does. right? That's the key. Characteristic activity is how something does what it does. So let's look at an example. A computer. The purpose of a computer is all the things that it does. What? Write emails, stream shows, cheat using chat GPT, and so on, right? So this is its purpose. This is the stuff that a computer does. Now, its ergon, or its characteristic activity, is how it does what it does. It's functional construction, how like it actually works, right? That's why work or working. How does it do its workings? That's what a computer does. And this is something, I don't know, you got to ask the computer scientists. I don't really know. It's something like retrieving information using Boolean operators. Some sort of stuff going on inside the computer, right? Electronically receiving information, retrieving information. Retrieving information using Boolean operators, gates, if-thens, all this sort of thing. That's how computers work. What they do is a bunch of stuff. How they do it is this one particular way. Okay, so the idea is, I think characteristic activity is how it goes about doing the things that it does. Its purpose is the things that it does. Now, these two are very related in some cases, right? Take a shelf. A shelf, the purpose is to put stuff on. And its characteristic activity, how it does this, is holding the stuff that you put on it. These are very, very linked, right? The characteristic activity and the purpose of a shelf. But in general, in more complicated cases like the computer, these two can come apart, right? Thing's purpose and its ergon can come apart. And that's what Aristotle thinks in the case of humans. So let us reinterpret the function argument using characteristic activity or ergon as the interpretation of the word function. So here's what it says. For all things that have an ergon, or characteristic activity, the good of that thing resides in performing its ergon well. Human beings have an ergon. The human being's ergon is what's peculiar to it. The activity of rational deliberation is peculiar to humans. So the good of a human is a life of rationally deliberating well. So that's what the argument now looks like. So with this interpretation, let's ask a couple questions. So first off, can human beings have an ergon, a characteristic activity, even if they don't have a purpose? Right? This was one of our worries, is whether human beings have a purpose whatsoever. And can they still have an ergon even if they don't have a purpose? I think the answer is plausibly yes. Suppose, go back to the butter passing robot from Rick and Morty. Suppose that the robot was created accidentally, like totally accidentally, just throwing stuff together, you create this butter passing robot. It would still seem like it has an ergon. Still seems like it has a way of doing things, even if it wasn't created for any particular purpose. So it seems like things can still have ergons even if they don't have a purpose. But second, it seems like we do have the Darwinian purpose. Which is survival and reproduction. It's plausible that we have this purpose of survival and reproduction. It's the evolutionary purpose. Life continues, it just keeps going on. So when Aristotle says the function of a human being is the activity of rational part of the mind or soul, he does not mean that reasoning is our purpose, nor is it particularly peculiar to us. Instead, it's how we human beings do what we do. So the ergon of humans is the ways in which we survive and reproduce. Which Aristotle thinks is rational deliberation. Okay. Second question. What the heck is going on? Remember in the previous one, I said that there was no justification for the claim that a human being's purpose is what is peculiar to it. In fact, it's just a really strange thing to say that our purpose is what is peculiar to us. That just doesn't make any sense. Okay. But now, this claim that a human being's ergon is what is peculiar to it is basically true by definition. It is now true by definition. What do I mean by this? Well, why is the function, the ergon of humans, what is peculiar to humans? Well, that's because ergon just is whatever distinctive way of doing things humans have. What is that distinctive way of doing things? Well, that's what's peculiar to us. That's what characteristic activity means. And so premise 3 just follows by the definitions of ergon and peculiar. Additionally, for each living thing, which has the Darwinian purpose, it has its own function, its own way of going about surviving. For each living creature, it has its own, we might even say peculiar, way of going about survival and reproduction. Has its own peculiar way of doing these things. Plants, starts to explain some of the stuff that Aristotle was talking about that confused us last time. Plants have nutrition and growth. This was the phrase that Aristotle used, nutrition and growth. But we can even be more specific. You know, like different plants have different peculiar ways of going about surviving. You know, climbing plants, you know, like beans. I'm planting, I just planted a garden, so we have, what are they called? Sugar snap peas, which are climbing plants. The way climbing plants work is they come out of the ground and then they just start spiraling, looking for something to latch onto so that they can grab it and then continue climbing it. That's the way that they go about surviving and reproducing, is they just fling their limbs to spiral and catch onto something. Other plants have different ways of doing it. Venus flytraps have an open gullet that has sweet nectar in the bottom that attracts animals, flies to it, which then closes on those animals and slowly kills them and then takes their nutrients, right? So that's its particular way of going about doing things. Some grow tall, some grow wide. There's all these different ways of going about surviving and reproducing, even for plants. Non-human animals nutrition, growth, and perception, and other abilities, right? And, the domain of biology, evolutionary biology, is just talking about each particular way of living that each of these creatures does. That's not all they do, but that's one portion of evolutionary biology. It's talking about how each creature survives its ecological niche. And so that's what the ergon of living creatures is how it goes about surviving and reproducing. Okay. Question 3. Premise 4. Let's just talk about premise 4. That's not a question, but don't worry. It's just to keep it, So human beings live their lives in a way that other non-human animals do not. Most animals, generally speaking, live on instinct and environment. The interplay between instinct and environment. That's generally how different animals live. And what this means is most animals of the same species live generally the same sort of life. Given the same environment, they would live the same. Right? This seems reasonable. Okay. But human beings are capable of choosing. And choosing in particular on the basis of reasons. A human being decides a career, they decide how to spend their afternoons, they decide in general how to live and what they will live for. In a way that other creatures generally don't. Humans thus have a specific form of life for which reason is how we perform this way of living. I have written already. Humans thus have a specific form of life for which reason is how we perform this way of living. We decide via rational deliberation. Okay. Now let's maybe go back real quick to this page. Right here. These were the objections to the naive function argument, right? Start with 1. For all things that have a purpose, the good of that thing resides in fulfilling its purpose well. We put up some objections to this. They were counterexamples. Butter passing robot has a purpose, but it seems like the good for it/him is not merely passing butter. Now, when we move this to ergon, this sort of goes away. It doesn't, or at least it's not clearly false anymore. So the butter passing robot has emotions, capabilities, all these sorts of things. And this premise is the good life for the butter passing robot is to do that stuff well, to fulfill its emotions, its emotional capacities, its physical capacities, these sorts of things. And to do that would do a lot more than merely passing butter. And so premise 1 can get around this counterexample of the butter passing robot. It says the good life for the butter passing robot is not merely passing butter. Same thing with the microplastics one. The good life for the humans is not merely fulfilling our purpose. It's instead doing a good job at the way in which we go about living. Okay, second premise. Human beings have a purpose. The fallacy of composition. First off, remember Aristotle's argument for this premise was that since the hands, feet, and everything all have a purpose, so too does the whole human. This argument didn't work. But if we look at it a different way, we might think that what Aristotle is doing is giving us examples of things that have characteristic activities. Eyes, hands, feet. The hands have a purpose of grasping things, but the way they do it is by electrical signals that then activate the muscles that allow us to do all these sorts of things. And so it's not clear that he's giving an argument for it so much as he's giving examples of characteristic activities. But I don't want to defend him too much. Maybe he just gave a bad argument. Second objection to this was the theory of evolution. We've noted that something can have an ergon, a characteristic activity, without even having a purpose. Nevertheless, we might think that human beings do have the Darwinian purpose. And so this isn't an objection anymore, because premise 2 in the sophisticated one says human beings have an ergon. So evolution doesn't push back at all against whether or not we have a way of going about doing life. Which is true, we do have a way of going about doing life. So premise 2 sticks once we replace with ergon. Third, a thing's ergon is what is peculiar to it. Our objection, why? But now we see that this kind of follows by definition of ergon. Ergon is the particular way something does what it does. And so a thing's ergon is what is peculiar to it. That's just what it means to have an ergon. Okay, last thing. The activity of rational deliberation is peculiar to humans. Okay. This premise actually looks the same. Are we the only creatures that rationally deliberate? Dolphins, octopus, aliens, some monkeys. Aristotle is going to have to say something more here. You can't just push back in the ordinary, way that we did with the other ones. So would it matter to Aristotle if there are other creatures who rationally deliberate? I think not. I think he'd be okay with it, generally speaking. And the reason that is because whether or not it's peculiar to humans, it is how we go about doing things. And so it's our peculiar form of life. Peculiar meaning special to us or something, or just all humans have this or something like that. But even if you don't, I think he can even say more. I think he can say that human beings both have rational deliberation and the set of emotional capacities that we human beings have. No other creature has that. No other creature has the kinds of bodies and minds that we do, where rational deliberation is interplaying between our emotional and physical capacities as human beings. Okay, and we see that making fire, destroying the environment, all these things are not the ergon of humans. These are things we do. These are not how we do them. The way we do them is via rational deliberation. And so we can see that these original objections that we had actually start to fall apart when we reinterpret function as meaning ergon rather than purpose. Okay. So that is the sophisticated function argument. It's a reinterpretation of the word ergon, of the word function, in favor of characteristic activity. Okay. Final thing. So the conclusion of this argument, where are you? Over here. Is the good of a life the good of a human is a life of rationally deliberating well. So what does it mean to rationally deliberate well? What does it mean to rationally deliberate well? Does it mean something like always having a reason for your actions and making sure you sit and think through things? Is that what it means to rationally deliberate well? No, for Aristotle. The answer is no. This is not what rational deliberation means. No. It means reasoning well. Having good reasons for your actions rather than bad reasons. So here's a silly example. A person who turns the hose on their neighbor might be doing it because her neighbor is on fire. Or she might be doing it because she thinks her neighbor is possessed by demons and the water expels demons. The first of these is a good reason to spray your neighbor with the hose. The second one is a bad reason to spray your neighbor with the hose. So let me type this out. So the first of these is a good reason to turn the hose on your neighbor. The second of these is a bad reason to turn the hose on the neighbor. Both are reasons. But for Aristotle, rationally deliberating well means acting on good reasons and not acting on bad reasons. So it's not merely thinking through things. So what does reasoning well? The answer is a little, I don't know, it's not unsatisfying, but you'll start to get a sense of what Aristotle's going for here. So good reasoning means doing the right thing for the right reason. And more so, having doing the right thing for the right reason come from choosing that thing for that reason. But we don't have to talk about that. So deliberation isn't merely about how to achieve a certain end, but about what is worth doing for the sake of what else. Okay, so the specifically human function, the ergon of humans, is a life of activity in accordance with the principles of doing A for some reason R for the sake of doing A for that reason R. Okay. I'll write this out. Okay, so the ergon of a human is a life of activity in accordance with the principles of doing A for some reason R for the sake of doing A for that reason R. A life, as we might put it, in which your actions are shaped and directed by your values. And your activity and actions are an embodiment of your deliberative choices. Okay. Final thing. This is what Aristotle thinks happiness amounts to. Let's make this big. This is what eudaimonia, or happiness, amounts to. It's not that happiness results from doing A for reason R for the sake of doing A for reason R. It's what happiness is. Flourishing, successful living, just is doing things that are in fact worth doing and doing them for their own sake. That's what happiness is for Aristotle. Doing things that are in fact worth doing for the sake of doing them. Okay, that's what happiness amounts to for Aristotle. That's what a life of activity in accordance with reason is. So how do we achieve this? How do we do this? That's the question. And this is where virtues are going to come into play. So that's what we'll start on next time. So this is the sophisticated function argument. It's where we swap out purpose for ergon and all the problems seem to go away. There's a couple reasons why I choose to do it this way. The first is, I think this is a good argument, this one here. I'm not sure if I'm fully convinced by it, but it's a really good argument. Once we interpret something as ergon rather than purpose, it's pretty tough to push back. I'll be interested to hear what you all have to say about where you think this goes wrong. But I think this is a good objection. Or good argument. Sorry, I'm losing all my ability to use my brain. Okay, so that's what I have. I'll send an email out regarding strike activity next week and what's going to happen. Seems like the strike is on as of right now, and I will be striking. So, yeah, that's where we're at. So, yeah. Not sure if I'll be holding office hours tomorrow yet. We shall see. Maybe on Zoom. I'll shoot you all an email or something. Hope you're all doing well. Have a nice day.